Hello. How's about now? Anything? We're all good? Alright. Audi gave me the okay, that means we're all good. Alright, welcome everyone to another episode of Insights on the Sages. We're going to be dealing with the Herodian period with Herod the Great or Herod the Tyrant, depending who you ask. In particular, with we're going to have Hillel and Shammai, the elders. We're going to discuss Shammai's predecessor, Menachem, a little bit. Going to go into the schools of thought that Hillel and Shammai ended up developing. We're going to also discuss Bava ben Buta, the disciple of Shammai, who was also a moderate and kind of interesting fellow. To start off with, last time, as we recall, we're still in the era of the Zugot, which is the era of the pairs, when leadership in the Sanhedrin was kind of divided. You had the Nasi and the Av Beit Din, Nasi acting more as the true official, especially the face of the Sanhedrin, and also the Av Beit Din was kind of like a vice president, able to jump in and replace the Nasi in case he was incapacitated somehow. Last time we saw the end pretty much of the Hasmonean dynasty, which were the Jewish kind of priest kings that had come to power after the events that created Hanukkah, with Herod coming in with the help of Rome and taking Jerusalem. The last Zugot, Avtalion and Shemaiah, were very introverted and against the kind of outward political policies that had been common amongst the Sanhedrin, and this trend would continue with Hillel and Shammai, we see a major change in the legal discussions of these people. They start to focus exclusively on ritual and observance, and we don't really see much commentary on how to conduct themselves as rulers and how to conduct themselves in the political climate. And this was kind of an acknowledgement of the shift. With Herod in power, there's no longer true Jewish autonomy. Though he initially seemed to try to be on good terms with the Sanhedrin, he spent much of his time focusing on bringing in Jews from the diaspora, such as his appointment of a Babylonian high priest, and as well as Jewish groups who tended to be at odds with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who had been the two major players during the Hasmonean period, which is his devotion to the Essen group in particular. Now, Herod was a very practical person. Let's see here. As we recall, I made a statement a few classes ago talking about how Yohanan Hyrcanus and his conquering of the Edomites and forceful conversion of them would eventually be their downfall. Now, Herod himself was actually an Edomite, son of Antipater. And there's a lot of debates, even amongst the sages, about Herod's exact status. Though Herod, for the most part, outwardly professed Judaism, as they were now a Jewish portion of the Jewish people, there's also the issue of the Edomites having been enslaved. And according to Jewish law, if your mother was a slave, you inherit the mother's status of being a slave. There is some debate about whether or not Herod himself was born of a slave. Some commentators say that he actually was born of an Edomite princess. Others say he was born of a Nabatean slave, which is recalled the Nabateans were the people, the Arabian people, who also had been attacked a few times by the Hasmoneans, and some of them enslaved and converted as well. A quick little link here for you guys. I feel like delving further into the issue of Herod's ancestry has been linked into the chat there. Herod himself was very good at trying to play all sides. He sent his children off to receive Roman educations. He actually helped support Hellenic institutions, and in fact, he was the first to start bringing really Hellenic and Roman culture into the Judean province, which under Hasmonean rule had been pretty much exclusively a Jewish region, whereas we saw the Galilee tended to be more influenced by Hellenic thought. He even, Times of Israel, of all places, actually was discussing how Herod was the one who saved the Olympics. I'll link that article as well. Kind of a little succinct discussion on that. So this is the same Herod we're talking about who would also be involved in building Jewish sites around Israel. And the remains of the Second Temple that we actually have standing today, the Temple platform, is actually a product of Herod's building, not of the original Second Temple built by Ezra and Nehemiah and the returning Babylonian Jews. But we have here some rabbinic commentary on Herod himself. In Bava Batra, we have here, it says, Herod was a slave of the Hasmonean dynasty, and had set his eyes on a certain maiden of that dynasty. One day he heard a heavenly echo proclaim, every slave that rebels now will succeed. So he rose up and killed all of his masters, but spared the maiden. When she saw that he wanted to marry her, she went up onto a roof and cried out, whoever comes and says, I'm from the Hasmonean dynasty, is a slave. For none remained from the Hasmonean dynasty but for a maiden, who threw herself off the roof. Herod preserved her body in honey for 7 years. Some say he had relations with her, others say they did not. Herod asked, who are those who teach, set a king over yourselves from among your own people? The sages. He therefore rose up and killed all the rabbis, but spared Bava ben Buta, who became his advisor. So, although this is kind of a short and exaggerated version of Herod, he did in fact do a lot of political assassinations. He was well known for that, in fact. So it seems that although he did end up having multiple wives through his career, he at one point did marry Miriam of the Hasmonean dynasty. She's the granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, who had been exiled to Babylonia by Aristobulus. This was an attempt to kind of preserve the integrity of his own line, because he's now fusing it with the Hasmoneans. It's no longer just Herodian dynasty. The Hasmoneans live through him, was his attempted goal. However, he specifically chose the exiled branch of the family because this had to do with his attempt to integrate foreign Jews more into his policies. According to Josephus, Herod's mother-in-law was upset that Herod had appointed his Babylonian friend as the high priest, and she believed that Aristobulus III, her son, deserves the office. So Herod decided that when they were going swimming, Aristobulus and himself are out in a swimming pool in the Jericho palace, and he decided to drown him, getting rid of that contender. Next to die was his grandfather, Hyrcanus II, and Herod ultimately even executed his mother-in-law when she tried to exploit a time when he was ill, and captured his Jerusalem palace. And some say he killed his wife Miriam, others say that she committed suicide. That one's kind of up to conjecture. So we can see he had a very bloody reign. Anything that he thought might be a threat to his rule was immediately crushed. And this would eventually include even rabbis who disagreed with him. This was the world that Hillel and Shammai came into. Now, first of all, before we discuss the famous issue of Hillel and Shammai, probably the most famous of the Zugot, there actually was someone who came along before Shammai. And we see in the Mishnah of Hagiga. So there was a major issue on whether or not to lay hands on particular sacrifices being brought, and this kept being debated for several generations of the Zugot. Shemaiah says he may lay his hands, Abtalion says he may not. Hillel and Menachem did not differ, but when Menachem left, Shammai replaced him. He said he said not to lay, and Hillel said to lay. So we see if Menachem had never left, we wouldn't even have a dispute. Shammai brought back the old Zugot tradition of each one kind of disagreeing. And there's a debate in the Babylonian Talmud why Menachem left. And this is also in Hagiga. Menachem left and Shammai replaced him. Where did he go? Abiah said he left for a path of evil. Rava said he joined the king's service. We also learned this in the Baraita. Menachem left to serve the king, and 80 pairs of students dressed in silk went with him. Silk was military, like officers' military attire. The Talmud and the Yerushalmi Talmud kind of disagrees. It says, where did he go? There are those who say from one extreme to another, so he was never a moderate person according to this. And there are those who say he left against his will. He and 80 pairs of disciples, clad in golden embroidered silk garments, with faces blackened like the sides of a pot, for they had been told, right on the horn of an ox, they shall have no part in the God of Israel. So, according to that one, he left into the military service, but he was completely kind of disowned. In a book, From Yanai to Herod, a scholar, Luria, cites a midrash about where Menachem left, referring to when this kind of civil war was going on in Israel. When, first of all, as we recall in the last class, during the days of Shammai and Hillel, there was the civil war between the two brothers, and then Herod kind of rose up during this occasion, and there was also some struggling within. So according to this, it says, another interpretation, flee, my beloved. When? In the days of Menachem and Hillel. Whereas there's a dispute between them, Menachem left, together with 800 students, clad in golden embroidered silk. Hanan ben Matron and Banayin ben Yehuda, Menachem's brothers, came and killed him. Then Eleazar and his students arose and hacked him into pieces. At that time, Hamo's men had besieged Yerushalayim and defiled all of its women. Eleazar and his students arose and killed all those besieging soldiers. At the same time, Jerusalem was plunged into strife. So, according to that one, image timed out. According to that one, he didn't so much leave as he did join some military service and was fighting during the several civil wars that occurred within Jerusalem's own walls, which also could have occurred during the time when Jerusalem was being besieged, even because there would obviously be different factions, some vying for different parties coming to power, others choosing this time to try to take hold of the political power gap. Some scholars attest that Menachem had sided with Herod, and I will cite their reasoning there. Others say he was trying to support the Hasmonean claim, and he was attempting to retain Hasmonean power as it slowly slipped toward Roman control. Let's see, where does it say here? So the scholars that say he was supportive of Herod often refer to him as Menachem the Essen, which, even if you look on Wikipedia, they specifically make a reference to him being an Essen. And this comes from attempting to identify the Menachem quoted by Josephus as being the same Menachem who was a Tana, a sage. So Josephus writes, there was a certain Essen named Menachem, whose whole conduct of life attested to his virtue, especially in his having received from God a foreknowledge of the future. This man once saw Herod when he was still a schoolboy and saluted him as King of the Jews, which was the title that the Romans would later give him. Herod, who thought that the man either did not know who he was or was teasing him, reminded him that he was only a private citizen. Menachem, however, gently smiled and slapped him on the backside, saying, nevertheless, you will be king, and you will rule the kingdom successfully, for you have been found worthy of this by God, and you will remember the slaps given by Menachem. As Herod gradually rose to the throne, and to good fortune, and achieved the height of his power, he sent for Menachem. From then on, he held all Essens in esteem. Whether or not this episode of an Essen predicting his rise to power occurred or not, I feel like this was more of an attempt to explain why Josephus favored the Essens so much, when I feel, in reality, the easier answer is that the Essens were kind of placed outside the normal political camps within Judea itself, and this followed Herod's typical technique of trying to favor Jews who are not of Judean extraction. Further, I find it unlikely that Menachem himself was an Essen, for they didn't tend to get along with the Pharisees or the Sadducees, tend to be pretty separatist. So, although it's possible an Essen could have been one of the Tanaim, it seems highly unlikely, especially for one to become a member of the Zugot. But, we don't know for sure. This was the person who preceded Shammai. Whatever exact reasons he left, Shammai came in. Let me look at my notes here. Okay. Alright, so we'll discuss Hillel's major techniques and what made him interesting. Hillel came from a poor family. He came from Babylonia, though others attest that he came from Alexandria, which, as you recall, some scholars say that Shammai and Hillel were not converts, as some claim, but that they are from Alexandria, and so it would make sense for another Alexandrian to come and succeed them as Nasi. Also, his techniques were focused on mental acuity, the ability to think on your feet, and to come up with the same legal rulings or even new legal rulings based on logic, rather than simply on received tradition. This would be the major difference between Hillel and Shammai. Shammai was more capable of simply holding the traditions in his mind and carrying them through. So he could cite to you what the previous sages had said and tell you the halacha from there. Whereas Hillel would do mental feats and figure out either a new halacha or even reach the same conclusion, but through different techniques. So there's Tosefta, which says, it once happened that the 14th of Nisan coincided with Shabbat. So they asked Hillel the elder, does the Paschal offering override Shabbat? He replied, do we only have a single Paschal offering during the course of the year which overrides Shabbat? We have many more than 300 Paschal offerings during the year, and they all override Shabbat. All the people in the courtyard ganged up on him. He said to them, the daily burnt offering is a public offering, and the Paschal offering is a public offering. Just as the daily offering is a public offering and overrides Shabbat, so too the Paschal offering is a public offering and overrides Shabbat. Alternatively, regarding the daily offering, it says its appointed time, and regarding the Paschal offering, it says its appointed time. Just the daily offering, regarding which it states its appointed time overrides Shabbat, so too the Paschal offering, regarding which it says its appointed time overrides Shabbat. Furthermore, there is a Kal Vachomer argument, which is the a fortiori argument. They had different words for it in Hebrew. If the daily offering on account of which people are not liable to karet, which is to be separated from the people, override Shabbat, the Paschal offering on account of which the people are liable to karet, is it not logical that it too should override Shabbat? Moreover, so see, he used his mental acuity first, then he moves on. Moreover, I have received a tradition from my masters that the Paschal offering overrides Shabbat. Not only the first Passover, but the second Passover. Not only the communal Paschal offering, but even the Paschal offering of the individual. And then they asked him, well, the people who did not bring their knives and Paschal lambs to the temple do? He replied, let them be, for the divine spirit rests on them. If they're not prophets, they're disciples of the prophets. And then there's a quick little story about them either putting the knife into the fur of the lamb, the wool of the lambs, so it'd stick in and then they could walk their lamb there, or if they're bringing goats, they could tie it between the horns of the goats and the goats would carry it. So this is kind of a succinct version. We actually have extended versions, which I don't think we'll have the time to read them all the way through if we want to talk about Shammai as well. But if you ever get the chance to look in Pesachim in the Yerushalmi, it's the 6th chapter. If you ever get the same section, but in 66a of the Babylonian, you'll see the differences between the two. In the Yerushalmi, the main focus is on how the elders of the Torah forgot whether or not you could give the Paschal offering, and Hillel in that focuses on giving them his master's words more than his own. So it mentions that he expounded to them in the Yerushalmi, but ultimately it's his master's words. Whereas in the Babylonian, the main emphasis is on the mental feats he can do himself, which follows more of the Babylonian thought process in Alexandrian, and then kind of exasperated when they won't accept his logic, he finally tells them, if that's not enough, my masters told me this was correct. These two disputes can almost sometimes be seen in the yeshiva system today still. In some places you go, you're not really allowed to think outside the box as much, and you're mostly just supposed to sit and listen and ask questions. Certain questions aren't even necessary to be asked. In other places, they promote the idea of individual learning and then even debating with your rabbi, and then the rabbi can correct you if he has a greater amount of knowledge. And it's interesting that this kind of continued, this kind of a divergent thought process continued, considering that all the yeshivas of today are the descendants of the Babylonian tradition and not of the Judean tradition. Another good thing to, to further emphasize the difference, where'd it go? I lost it. Here it is. Further emphasize difference, traditionally there is a blessing that you recite before going into the Beit Midrash or studying the Gemara, and in the Yerushalmi it focuses on not getting angry at your colleagues, and that you don't get humiliated by the forbidden and for forbidding the permitted. Whereas in the Babylonian, it has almost the same exact statement, but then instead it says not that they don't want to be humiliated, but so that your fellow students don't mock you. And it also asks that you be wittier than your fellow students. It's a very different kind of personalities in these two different schools. Let's see, we have some questions in here. I would go crazy just sitting and listening. Very true. They used to essentially have different levels of where the disciples would be. Once we get past the destruction of the temple, there's actually a lot of discussion about where people are supposed to sit in the Beit Midrash. Those who are more learned are permitted to sit closer to the Tanaim, and they are also even permitted necessarily to speak out with what they think. Whereas if you get further pushed back, it means the less Torah knowledge you have and the less capable you are of even debating the issue to begin with. And there would even be people who would have to sit outside during times of dispute and not be permitted within the Beit Midrash itself. We see here it says, I would be afraid of asking something you're not supposed to ask. It can be daunting. I've been in a few establishments where they have kind of codes of conduct toward what questions would be asked. Fortunately, I'm too much of a punk not to, so I didn't really fit in those yeshivas. Hillel was also well known for his patience. They had a case of where someone came to him and they'd made a bet, I think it was for 200 zuzim, that they could make him angry. They kept asking him really strange questions like, why do Babylonians have round heads? Why do Palmyrines have sandy eyes, or like blotted eyes? And then Hillel would say things like, oh, well, it's because they live where there's a lot of sand, so it gets in their eyes. Things like this. I forget which people he asked about, but he also asked, why do such and such people have white feet? And just questions meant to throw Hillel off his balance. And Hillel just patiently answered every question. And the man ended up losing his money and was quite upset about it. But Hillel, in a strange statement, also says that he is worth another 200 zuzim. So he's essentially saying that what he'd bet wasn't nearly enough to even try to rattle him anyway. Which is kind of a strange statement. It doesn't seem very modest, but there is a Jewish concept that truly humble people can speak about their own virtues so long as they don't do it with an ego. This is cited back to when the Torah itself talks about Moshe being the most humble person. It doesn't really make sense if Moshe was writing portions of the text, but there it is. Let's see, we also have the famous case of the convert. Or, according to some, he was technically trying to become a Noahide, which are non-Jews who practice monotheism as per the Jewish regulations, and they practice the 7 laws of Noah. In this famous story, the convert first goes to Shammai and asks, how many Torah do you have? Shammai says, we have 2. We have the written and we have the oral. And the convert basically says he only wants to believe in the written. So Shammai chases him away, I think with a measuring stick, if I recall correctly. And then he goes over to Hillel. He says the same thing. And Hillel ends up teaching him the Aleph Bet, so Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, etc. Brings him back in the next day, and he then there says the opposite. He starts teaching him like Dalet, Gimel, Bet, Aleph, and the convert goes, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't what you told me yesterday. And Hillel points out that he only knew this through received tradition. So it's the same for the Jews today. Although you do have the written Torah, it's more of like the constitution, and the evolving halacha is how the people will react to it and be able to discuss it and understand it. There's nothing in the written Torah that tells you that Aleph comes before Bet. It's just something that we developed as a people. There's also another very similar story. Possibly they were the same convert, and then people got confused over the details. But in either case, another convert goes to Shammai and says, why don't you teach me the Torah while standing on 1 foot? Shammai chases him off again. Hillel stands on 1 foot, and he gives the golden rule. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah. The rest is explanation. And an important part that people often forget when they're quoting this, after he says the rest is explanation, he says, go forth and learn. So even though the rest is just explanation of this, it is important to know how to love your fellow. And that's what he believed that the Torah was about. Hillel was also about bringing sanctity into your daily acts. It was recorded that Shammai would find a good piece of meat and set it aside for Shabbat, and Hillel would find the same piece of meat and eat it immediately, praising God for what had been given. So Hillel was about imbuing the everyday, the profane, with sanctity, as well as being patient and using his mental acuity to continue to preserve Judaism. Now, Shammai, we have unfortunately less details about Shammai. Some say that the stories of his severity were actually merely kind of learning techniques so that you could understand the differences between the schools of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, which are not to be confused with Hillel and Shammai themselves. They'll each carry over the baggage of their beliefs. Forgot to write a note about. I had a note about where Shammai's famous maxim was. There it is. So it always kind of shows Shammai as like this very severe man, very uncompromising, but his actual statement in Avot is, make your Torah study a permanent aspect of your life, say little and do much, and greet everyone with a pleasant countenance. So some of this concept of what Shammai was like may have actually just been a tool for people learning to try to understand the differences in Shammai and Hillel's legal techniques. And also to give Shammai some credit, Shammai was the one trying to preserve the Jewish identity in a world which was being torn apart to him. Whereas Hillel and his disciples focused on individual ritualism, trying to incorporate into your day-to-day life, Shammai and his focused on making sure that Jews remained Jews, that they didn't incorporate too many Hellenic aspects. He tried to preserve more of the ritual impurity of things to avoid contact with the Romans who now controlled. He probably especially saw a threat in people such as Herod, who didn't truly come from Jewish ancestry and by Jewish law therefore couldn't be a Jewish king, and how he still was garnering the favor of the people as well as turning them more and more toward Rome. And as more and more Roman institutions were being built up around him, such as theaters and gladiatorial fights, things like this, he was trying to preserve what it meant to be a Jew. So this would obviously come off as a very strict person. If you have all your buddies and you went out drinking, you come home, and your father yells at you, you would think your father is strict at that time. And that's kind of the personality of Shammai. Later, this probably translated into people applying him to stories simply to be the counterpoint to what Hillel was supposed to be like. So I try to give Shammai a little more credit than some other people do. Let's see. Okay, so we have a little bit more on the info on how they focused less on political things in those days. This is, incidentally, also the time where the book of Ezekiel seems to have been resolved. For a while, it's kind of immediately following their time, actually, possibly during the days of Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. But we have Hananiah ben Hekeziah ben Garon. He was one of the Tanaim, and supposedly took 300 barrels of oil up into a chamber with him, and he shut himself up, and he just read and read until he could resolve all of the inconsistencies and or considered heresies of the book of Ezekiel, allowing its canonization into the Hebrew Bible today. And this is just kind of a common theme of this era, that they're going to be focusing more and more on what's considered a Jewish text, what it means to be a Jew, what individual Jews have to do. We have a question in the chat. Do you think Hillel is the beginning of a modern Judaism? I actually will be discussing that a little bit today, a little bit further along. I would say it's a facet of modern Judaism, but definitely not the whole picture. It won't really be until after the destruction of the temple that we'll see modern Judaism begin to flourish. So then we run into where'd he go? Where'd my note? So we run into Bava ben Buta, the disciple of Shammai. So he, first of all, is kind of a moderate. Even though he's going to be following Shammai. So in the Yerushalmi, moderate legally speaking, I'll discuss how he's not a moderate later and some other things. But in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in Hagiga, and in the Tosefta for Hagiga as well, I'll do the Tosefta because it's usually more succinct. Once it happened that Hillel the elder laid his hands on the burnt offering in the temple courtyard, and the disciples of Shammai ganged up on him. He said to them, "Look, it is a female, and prepared to bring as a peace offering." He continued to speak as such, and they went away. So it's obvious that even though Hillel was the Nasi, often the students of Shammai had precedence in the Judean territories. Immediately thereafter, Beit Shammai became dominant and resolved to fix the halacha in accordance with their view. One of the students at this time was Bava ben Buta, who was a student of Shammai, and he knew that the halacha was always in accordance with Beit Hillel. He therefore went and brought all the flocks of Kedar, placed them in the temple courtyard, and proclaimed, "Whoever wishes to bring burnt offerings and peace offerings, let him come and take one and lay his hands." They came and took the beasts and brought burnt offerings and laid their hands. On that day, the halacha was fixed in accordance with Beit Hillel, and no one challenged it. So, first of all, there's probably some later understandings added into that story because when Hillel passed away, Shammai became Nasi, and the era of the Zugot, the pairs, ended. He essentially fused the establishments of Nasi and Av Beit Din, and there's no longer an Av Beit Din in his day. So Beit Shammai had supremacy of the halacha. There's also a story about the day that Hillel was arguing with Shammai logically about why certain fruits at certain times is considered impure and certain times is not when it's being brought in to be pressed, because they all knew that certain liquids from certain fruits became susceptible to ritual impurity, and Hillel was arguing with Shammai about why only certain fruits once they're picked, could be susceptible to impurity and others not. And Shammai Hillel to listen to his decrees, and Hillel had to accept them. So we see that Shammai was a very strong person, and that Hillel, being the person that he was willing to accept Hillel's authority, even though he was technically the Nasi. So the story about how Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai were arguing with Hillel and the supremacy was being fought over that time isn't necessarily true. In fact, many scholars argue that it's not until the reconstruction of the Sanhedrin at Yavne after the destruction of the temple that we see Beit Hillel being established as the halacha. The stringencies of Shammai may have been upheld up until that time, though disciples of Hillel would have obviously continued to practice Hillel's version of Judaism. We see that it does give an insight that Bava ben Buta, although he was Shammai's disciple, was willing to accept logical conclusions which were contrary to the previous generation. And I think that was what they were trying to show with that story more than anything else. Bava ben Buta, although he was a moderate in regards to halacha, he was not himself a very moderate person. As it shows in another Tosefta for Keretut, Rabbi Eliezer said, a man may vow an undetermined guilt offering any day and any time he wants. It's called the guilt offering of righteousness. They said, Bava ben Buta, they had volunteered such a guilt offering every day, except for the day after Yom Kippur. One day he said, I swear by all that is holy, if they would let me, I would offer even on this day. But they told me to wait until I enter the realm of doubt. So he is very reminiscent of the Hasidim that we discussed, of the early Hasmonean period, and even later on when we run into Honi the Circle Maker. And in fact, if you read the book of Job, or Job, we see that he starts out as a very very pietistic person too, offering guilt offerings for his children, on behalf of them in case they inadvertently sinned. Although later, as you go through that wisdom work, his opinion kind of changes. But this is probably kind of a place where the Hasidim drew from. They were people who constantly worried about their spiritual well-being, although they often tended to be very kind to others, and they also tended to be willing to accept the less stringent opinions on ritual purity that the Pharisees would enact for the masses, though not for themselves. Bava ben Buta is also supposed to be the last surviving sage when Herod goes on his rampage, which probably isn't really true, because then we couldn't have the houses of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai at all. But he probably is the most prominent person. So it says in Bava Batra, it talks about, one day Herod came and sat before the now blinded Bava ben Buta, who he had blinded Bava and kept him alive when he had killed others. And he said, look, master, what this wicked slave, i.e. himself, is doing. He probably was hoping that Bava, being blinded, wouldn't recognize Herod's voice. What do you want me to do to him? Replied Bava ben Buta. He said, I want you to curse him. Bava ben Buta replied with the verse, even your thoughts you could not curse a king. You should not curse a king. Herod said to him, but he is no king. Bava replied, "Even if you were only a rich man, I could not curse him, for it is written, 'And in your bedroom do not curse the rich.' Or were he only a prince, I could not curse him, as is written, 'You shall not curse a prince among your people.'" Herod replied, "This applies only one who acts as one of your people, but this man does not act as one of your people." He said, "I'm afraid of the king." "But," said Herod, "there is no one who can go and tell him, since we two are quite alone." He replied, "For a bird of the sky shall carry the voice, and a winged creature will betray the matter." Herod then said, "I am Herod. Had I known that the rabbis were so cautious, I would not have killed them. Now tell me how I can make amends." He replied, "Since you have extinguished the light of the world, as is written, 'For the commandment is a light and the Torah is a lamp.' Go now and tend to the light of the world. It is written, 'All the nations will stream to it.'" So he makes a connection to the rabbis and the temple. He's saying that he extinguished one light, which were the rabbis, so he should help rebuild the temple, which had been damaged during the Civil War. And the temple, even the rabbis admire the temple. They discuss how no one's seen great beauty until they've seen the temple of Herod. And this was also kind of representative of how the people felt about Herod. Some people were satisfied to finally see the corruption of the Hasmoneans gone, but on the other hand, Herod himself was full of corruption. But they also admired how much he beautified what was considered essentially the seat of God. This is where you're supposed to go and commune directly. All the major Jewish festivals are held there. So that story kind of shows the mixed views people held toward Herod. And in that story, it even shows Herod as being kind of repentant, which no one can be fully sure whether or not he's repentant or not. It's probably more likely that he's trying to cement his footing amongst the Jews in Judea by giving them something that they desire while simultaneously building Hellenic society up. We've got a few more minutes, but I'd like to discuss Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, their continued differences. Beit Hillel focused on the same aspect as Hillel, that you could incorporate Jewish values into day-to-day. It was they who ruled that the Shema, the prayer, Hear O Israel, that has to be pronounced morning and evening, by their understanding that when you rise up, when you lie down, refers to that time and not in your method. And Beit Shammai tried to say you could only say the Shema while laying down. And in fact, there will be a Tana I discuss later on who the rabbis claim that his life was forfeit when he was almost mugged for saying the Shema this way, because by that time Beit Hillel had gained supremacy in the realm of halacha. And we see even later, we're going to next class discuss Rabban Gamliel, who, though he comes from Hillel's lineage, Beit Shammai still seems to be in supremacy. Try to figure out if I'm forgetting anything. Is the Temple of Herod also known as the Roman Temple? I've never personally heard it referred to as the Roman Temple. Normally, most people refer to it as the Second Temple, and then they'll add on the point that it was Herod who rebuilt it and made the plaza which stands today. Some people have even tried to say that Bava ben Buta, while blinded, was the one who assisted in Herod in understanding the halacha about expanding the temple plaza and rebuilding it, because, for example, in the Holy of Holies, only priests could enter, and you're only supposed to enter at certain times, and so there's a lot of complicated things if you want it to be a proper site for the Jewish temple. So why do we hear all about Hillel, not a bunch about Shammai? That's because the halacha came in accordance with Beit Hillel. Like I said, according to that Tosefta, they try to claim this occurred during Hillel's own lifetime, when Baba ben Buta was quite active, but most scholarship seems to show that with the destruction of the temple, essentially the halacha of Beit Shammai became untenable, and the halacha of Beit Hillel came to be. There's also a scenario where supposedly a divine voice called out and said that the halacha must be in accordance with Beit Hillel, although both are correct in the eyes of heaven. I see it says, he rebuilt the second temple after it was messed up. Correct. It got damaged. And it wasn't a very impressive thing to begin with. The second temple was built by Babylonian returnees, some of whom were wealthy and others not so much. It's kind of like a group effort to rebuild the temple after it had been destroyed. We see here, they're saying, we hear more about Beit Hillel because his opinions were mostly accepted. Correct, though, as I said before, Beit Shammai held supremacy for a while. He probably is also favored during the Zealot period. Yeah, we see here Shammai ruled more harshly and Hillel ruled more leniently. It's also true. Most people seem to have implied that Hillel is more of a people's halacha, where Shammai is more of elite, which actually carried into their schools to some degree. That's actually something I forgot to mention. Beit Hillel focused on expanding the number of students. They wanted Torah to be easily accessible by as many people as possible. So Beit Shammai, following Shammai's logic, believed it should only go to those who deserve it. And again, this goes with Shammai's belief that if you throw it out to the masses, it will become corrupted, especially with so many Hellenizing trends. He's concerned about what the conduct of the Torah would be for the future content of the Torah would be for future generations. Whereas Hillel had more faith in the people, and he believed that those who are willing to try to seize onto the Torah were those who are going to treat it with proper respect. And I see I'm cutting into someone else's time. So I think this is it for this class. And glad I was able to actually fill up a full one this time. You join me all for next week. We're going to go into Rabban Gamliel. He's a very interesting character. He's the one to follow up after almost a little period where there weren't any real strong rulers of the Sanhedrin, probably due to Herod's massacring techniques. Alright, have a good one. Stick around for Torah Talk. And as always, please donate to OneShul. Up top there, there's a little button where you can do that. Have yourselves a good